Public dialogue and civic engagement are important. They play a role in improving the health and well-being of Texans across our great state. That's why Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas is proud to support Texas Tribune events like the conversation you're about to see.
Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Price and the Honorable John Smithee. Gentlemen, good to see you. Thank you for having us in Amarillo. Thank you for coming out today. So ordinarily I'd ask about public education and healthcare and transportation, but hell, we're 35 days from the presidential election. It's the most important presidential election of our lifetime. I'm going to get my Trump questions in first. How about that? So yesterday, the lieutenant governor who chairs the Trump Texas team put out a release in which he named all the people in elective office, members of Congress, members of the Texas House and Texas Senate who are on the Trump Texas team. I could not help but notice neither of your names on that release. Representative Price, what don't you like about Mr. Trump?
Answer that.
You didn't think this was going to be easy, did you? Come on.
Right out of the gate. No, let me be real clear about this because this can get misreported. But the fact is, I support our Republican nominee. I support Donald Trump, and I will be on that list that you mentioned. I just had not talked to anybody. I guess.
Nobody asked you to be on.
Yeah. So the fact is, I think that, but I have talked to him now, and so
I bet.
and they're watching, I'm sure.
I
but
bet.
But three reasons stand out to me
Yes.
that make that decision really important. And one is our energy policy and the future of energy in Texas and what I think a Clinton administration would do versus what I think a Trump administration would do with respect to energy, which is very important to our state's economy. Secondly, I think monetary policy is very important. And I think that the amount of debt that we have and the way it's managed would look very differently under a Clinton administration than a Trump administration. And thirdly, the judiciary and the process of appointing Supreme Court justices I think is very important. So for those three reasons, I absolutely, and some others, support Trump.
Okay, Chairman, same deal. You're for him and just not on a list.
I'm all in for Trump. You got to realize we're up here, and nobody even knows we're up here. You know, well, they don't even ask.
Well, I
us.
wouldn't say nobody.
Well, until 1990, we weren't even on the official state highway map. We were over in the middle of New Mexico somewhere. And
Well,
so,
you could be for Gary Johnson then if you chose to be.
well,
right?
yeah. But no, I'm all
You're all in for Trump.
and I don't have a lot of patience for the Republicans that are holding back. I think the choice is clear. We've got to. I mean, if you're a Republican, you believe in conservative principles. I think
Right.
you've got to be for Trump.
Chairman Smithee, you've been around long enough to know that political issues get manufactured by my friends in the press and by others, but we had one this weekend come up related to Mr. Trump, the revelation by the New York Times that in all likelihood he's not paid federal income taxes for almost 20 years, that he had a loss of almost $1 billion back in 1995, despite the fact that he sold himself to us in part on his business acumen. Does that concern you at all? That was legal, of course, if he didn't pay taxes. Does it concern you at all?
No, I was actually, I suppose, impressed by his tax return from the standpoint that the return that was leaked didn't show anything that was even suggested to be illegal or unlawful.
Perfectly legal for him to take that carried balance forward.
And you know, he's over his career, he has risked a lot of capital.
Right.
And I think that's what America is all about, is risking capital, going out and taking risks, creating jobs, creating opportunity. I mean, that's the America that we grew up in. And so when you take risk, you're gonna have some losses. And so no, I mean, I thought it was. I know how it was spun, and it was spun the way we would expect it to be. But on balance, I was very relieved at what was in there.
Doesn't give you any pause. Chairman Price, I've met your wife a couple times. I know you've got at least one daughter. How many daughters?
Two daughters, two sons.
Two daughters. So you have women in your household. See if you can guess where this is going. So you're supporting.
I'm glad you're giving me all the easy questions.
What I tell you before, I'm going to give all the questions to Price. Hard questions to Price. So you're supporting a nominee who has had his challenges conveying his respect for women, and in the most recent period of time, the last week, he's gone on Twitter at 3 in the morning to take out after this woman, Alicia Machado, the former Miss Universe. You know that the Clinton campaign is making hay of Mr. Trump's seeming disrespect for women. When you look Mrs. Price in the face, or your daughters, can you say with a clear conscience, I'm supporting this guy and I'm not concerned about this part of his temperament?
Well, I can't say that I'm not concerned about that part of his temperament. I certainly, can look them in the eye for the reasons I just expressed a moment ago and said, this is why I'm making this choice. We've got essentially a binary choice, and that's the way I feel would be best for our country.
Yes.
But, it doesn't mean I have to agree with that candidate on every issue 100% of the time, no matter the circumstances. That's the case in any relationship. So I don't think my wife and I see eye to eye on every issue politically or everything all the
Maybe
time
I need
either.
to have her come up here.
Yeah, but I think that's the fairest response I can give you.
It's a good answer. Well, there are some people who would say, look, this community is going to vote for a Republican that's voted for a Republican for president for God knows how long. I believe Mitt Romney got 71 or 72% of Potter County last time, and we expect that Mr. Trump will do very well up here. Does it really even matter who gets elected? Well, you all know in the legislature, in fact, as much as we don't like the federal government here in Texas, who the president is does matter to the issues that we confront. And let me go, Chairman Smithee, to one of those that you all will pick back up in January when you gavel in for the 85th session. That's health care. Health care is now equal to, or depending upon how you calculate it, maybe even a little bit past education, as the #1 line item in the Texas budget for the first time in history. Healthcare costs have skyrocketed, hockey sticking in this state. 17.1% of our population has no health insurance, 4.6 million Texans. 8 of the 10 cities in this country with the highest percentage of uninsured are in the state of Texas. 8 of the 10 cities with the highest percentage. What are you going to do about this? And how does the presidential campaign intersect with your handling of this issue?
Well, I was chair of insurance for a number of years, and we spent a long time trying to figure out why we had such a high rate of uninsureds in Texas. And we always have. Traditionally, we have in health insurance. One of the interesting things that we discovered was that it breaks down like this among non-Hispanics, including African Americans. We're actually pretty close to average with the other states. Our problem has always been with, other than the lights,
Right.
has always.
We'll get to the utility problems in the state shortly. I did wonder if I was suddenly having an aneurysm, actually. I'm glad to know that I'm glad it wasn't just me. Okay.
But our problem has always centered on what is a larger than average Hispanic population in Texas. And you try to identify why we have a problem in that area. And this goes back before Obamacare. It goes back really a long way. And there were several reasons. One was that we had a somewhat higher, even then, had a higher than average entrance requirement into Medicaid programs. Secondly, we had a large percentage of Hispanic population that was engaged in primarily agricultural work, which traditionally has not had the insurance that other areas have. And the third reason was a cultural issue, that many Hispanics who were in the United States legally were hesitant to sign up for a system just because of cultural reasons. Many people in Texas of Hispanic heritage were actually going to Mexico to get their health care because they were more comfortable with that system. So that's kind of where our problem has been over the last few years. Of course, one of the issues right now is how much do you expand Medicaid? And there's a gap there that it's inarguable that you have a gap where between Medicaid ineligibility and access to the normal insurance market. And that's one of the areas that we the state has never, the legislature has never seen fit to expand Medicaid. And I think for good reason. I mean, we can't commit to that cost indefinitely.
Of course, there is money that's being, as the expression goes, left on the table, at least in the foreseeable future. It's quite a lot of money. And again, the costs of health care in the state, Chairman, as you know, having looked at budgets for so many years in the legislature, those costs are eating into every other priority that you have in the state, right?
They are. Every dollar that we have to spend on Medicaid is coming out of something else. It's coming out of education,
public
higher
education, transportation. Chairman Price, the reality, let me come at this a different way. The reality is that the people who Chairman Smith is referring to, the 17.1%, they can go to the emergency room and they can be seen. It's an inefficient and expensive form of care, but they can go and be seen. Yet while it's free to them, it's not free to the rest of us because those costs get passed along. This is an unsustainable situation, is
Well,
it not?
it's a very difficult situation, but I agree with Chairman Smithee with respect to the expansion of Medicaid issue. We can't afford it. And so the system isn't run efficiently, and it's not well operated
Right.
as it exists. And so just to expand it doesn't make a lot of sense. There's two reasons. One is I don't believe that we know where we would come up with the funds to sustain it once the federal match goes away, and it is going away.
Right.
So you've got that issue. And secondly, just expanding coverage is not the same thing as providing effective treatment. People can be covered, but they may not receive effective services. So I think we need to operate and focus on a better system. We need to incentivize our providers. We need to beef up our network of providers and do a better job there, which I think we're starting to try to do.
Right.
And it's tough because at a state with 27 million people, geographically diverse and
Right.
all the challenges that go along
And
with that.
and fast growing, right?
And
It'll be-
fast growing, we are expected to double in population. I guess state demographers project by 2050. So that really puts a lot of stress. And you mentioned the budget. We spend, in Article 2 on the budget, approximately 37% of our all funds budget on health care.
Yeah.
So when you combine that 37%, I think it's just a hair under 37%,
Right.
with the 37.1% in public and higher ed,
Yeah.
you've spent almost 3/4 of our state budget without addressing criminal justice and transportation and economic development and natural resources and all the other areas of state spending.
All of which are expensive and all of which are priorities. Let me stay with this for a second, though, because I hear both of you say we don't want to expand Medicaid, and I accept the political realities. This is a conservative state. We elect conservative state leaders. Conservative state leaders don't want to expand Medicaid or embrace the Affordable Care Act. Peace. I get that. But then it comes to what do we do as an alternative? And I hear you beginning to go there. But this is, Chairman Smithee says, Chairman Price, this is not a new problem. If this was a problem that Texas wanted to solve itself, not rely on the federal government, why haven't we solved it yet? What's taken us so long? If we want to take control of our future on this, why haven't we come up with a plan to solve it?
Well, I think primarily we have tremendous resistance from the federal administration about, CMS trying to approve whatever option or plan the state
So
of
you don't
Texas.
think we ultimately have the power ourselves, apart from the federal government, to solve this problem?
Well, Medicaid is a federal program that's administered by the state, so we do work within constraints that the federal government, puts on the state. And so it's not just solely our decision. So
Right.
it's difficult and it's very costly. So I think that's slowed, the number of options that are out there and what would be acceptable to both the state and the federal government.
Well, Chairman Smithee, to the point I made earlier, the decision in November does have a part to play in what happens in the state going forward. Mr. Trump, your candidate, says repeal and replace, doesn't say what, but he says repeal and replace. If Secretary Clinton gets in the White House, Chairman Smithee, you may have a case of Obama nostalgia.
That's right.
Everybody at the Capitol may be standing around going, where'd that nice man from Kenya go? I mean, you guys may wish you were back in the days of Yes, I Can, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because let me tell you what, Secretary Clinton is not going to go backwards on the Affordable Care Act. There are going to be things that people have wanted to be in place for some time. They're in place now, whether it's pre-existing conditions or keeping your kid on your health insurance for an additional year or what have you, and it's hard to give those up under ideal circumstances, but she's not going to go back on it. So what do you do as a legislature? I mean, the last session you all didn't do anything on this issue in the main, in part, I suspect, because you were looking ahead to a new president and hoping that one of your guys got in there. If one of your guys doesn't get in there, what are you going to do?
Well, that's the dilemma we're in. We've always believed that if Washington would just work with us, we could put the resources into a system to have a much better system and to cover a much larger percentage of our population.
You think you could work with Secretary Clinton and her folks, or will you have a choice, I guess, is the question.
Well, I don't know. If she prevails in the election, I agree with you. I don't necessarily think that's going to get much better. It may get worse for us. Our frustration has been the inflexibility of the federal government, and basically saying you either do it our way or you don't get the money.
Yeah.
We've always said if you'll work with us, give us the money and work with us, then we can put together a system. And so you've kind of got this logjam there. So I don't know what to expect in the event of a Clinton administration. You know, yesterday, former President Clinton made the statement that Obamacare's not working. It's you know, he said it's putting a burden on employers, and they're carrying more than their load of the bill, and employees are as well, who are paying insurance rates. And so I don't know where we'll go if we have a Clinton presidency.
All right. Well, let me ask you. You brought up the changing demographics of the state and the Hispanic community. Let me go to another issue that will be, again, something you all will have to deal with in this next session, but the choice of November effects, and that's immigration. Yeah. We've been talking about immigration reform, whether comprehensive or piecemeal in this country for some time. Haven't gotten to it. In some ways, politics and the politics of an election cycle naturally present an obstacle. But in the last session, you all approved, at least at the state level, to the degree that you're dealing with it, $800 million for border security. Senate wanted a little bit more. You all in the House wanted much less. Settled at $800 million. How's that going, Chairman Smithee? There seems to be some conversation around whether you have adequate metrics to this point to tell you whether that was a good decision to spend that money. How's it going?
Well, you know, Ford and I both were with the director of DPS,
Colonel
Steve
McCraw, right, just
a couple of weeks ago. And he gave us an update on kind of where we are on that. And it's a frustrating situation for DPS. You know, their hands are tied to a large extent with what they can do, but I think with the mission they've been given, you know, they're doing a remarkable job down there. What we needed was a presence on the border. When they first went to the border 2.5, 3 years ago, whenever it was, they were amazed that the federal border patrol agents had pulled 20 to 30 miles off the border. You never saw one of those border patrol SUVs on the border. So they worked with border patrol, it got them back on closer to the border, and they've done a remarkable job. They do the boat patrols, they do the helicopter patrols. You know, once they apprehend someone, I mean, they're very limited how they can deal with it.
Yeah.
But it does serve as a deterrent, because what you find out is, you know, you think the border is not under control. Well, it's under control, but unfortunately it's under control from the Mexican side by the cartels. And very little comes across that border without paying some tax or fee to the cartels.
Of course, my understanding, Chairman Smithee, is that net migration from Mexico now is at about zero, and that the deportations from this country back to Mexico and other countries are actually higher during the Obama years than they were in the Bush years. One might be forgiven for thinking that we came up with a solution to a problem that may not exist.
Well, I think, you know, that's a reflection of a number of things, not the least of which is our economy, which has slowed some in Texas.
So the incentive to come over has dropped.
But the other thing is who's coming. You know, we really need to know who's crossing the border, because there are a lot of bad people trying to get across the border. You know, gang members, drug issues, and those are the people that can do us real harm and have done us real harm, and that's where the real problem is.
Chairman, you think we have adequate data to tell you yet whether the money we're spending is working?
Well, the data that's coming in is relatively new, because the appropriation just happened during the last session, and so it takes a while to ramp up the operations and the operability among the counties that you know are along our southern borders.
Yep.
So they are, I think, doing a good job of capturing that data to let us know what it looks like. And apprehensions are down, which is a good thing. But what I want to say about that issue is it's easy to confuse our immigration policy, which is a federal policy, which is, you know, a hot topic, with what the DPS is actually doing for the state of Texas, which is securing, you know, the border for safety and security reasons, criminal justice reasons for Texans.
Yeah.
So no other state in the country dedicates resources even I mean, I don't even think any of the other border states along our southern border are doing anything close to what Texas has done with respect to securing the property for its citizens, with adding criminal justice support and law enforcement officers along the border. We graduated 250 more troopers so that we didn't have to start pulling them from, you know, counties across the state of Texas for their tour down on the border, and hopefully that will help.
Yep.
Not only down there, but locally as well. So I think it's real easy to confuse the immigration issue with the safety and security issue. We've got drug trafficking that starts along our southern border from what's happened with the illegal trade down there all the way up here. So
what about the conversation if we want to disaggregate border security from immigration? Let's ask what to do with the people in this country and in the state who are undocumented. Again, the candidate you support for president, Chairman, says we should deport everybody. We should have a deportation force, and we should deport everybody in this country who is undocumented. You agree with that?
I think it's impractical to say that we're going to deport everybody. I mean, millions of folks at one time. You know, I've never heard it explained, and I think it's impractical.
So what do we do with the people who are here without documentation?
Well, I mean, they need to obey the law. So we need to enforce the laws that we have. And if we do a good job at that, and actually those need to be strengthened, again, that's not within the purview of the state legislature. That's a federal issue. But if we do enforce the laws we have, which I don't think we've done a great job of, frankly, then I think we'll make a lot of headway.
Chairman Smithee, do you send people back and make them get in line? What do you do?
Well, I mean, first of all, you know, it's as Ford pointed out, a lot of other people pointed out, it's a theoretical discussion because we don't have the resources to, you know, to basically round up millions of people.
Well, it's not, Chairman, it's not theoretical. You have a candidate for President of the United States who has said point blank, on the first day I'm in office, I'm going to deport 11 million people. It doesn't sound theoretical to me.
Well, I think you practically can't do that the first day in office. But I think what you can do is you have a considerable number of people in this country who have been convicted of crimes and are, we know who they are. You can send them back. And that's the first thing. You know, you have to prioritize this.
Yeah.
You have to, there are certain people who need to be sent somewhere besides our neighborhoods, and that's where I would put the priority.
And we're not doing that now.
No, we're not doing
What
that.
about Chairman Smithee, Chairman Price, what about the idea of we're going to build a wall? That's obviously become the trope of tropes in this campaign is we're going to build a wall, we're going to make, who cares who pays for it, are we going to build a wall?
Well, you know, there are parts of a wall there now. If you
Right.
go down to the border, that were built in the latter years of the Bush administration. The problem is, though, you look at those walls and they make no sense because they run maybe a quarter of a mile and then there's no wall. Well, and plus, literally, I saw chain link gates in the fence above the wall that were open. So you have a wall and you have an open gate, you know, that's pretty easily accessible.
This is maybe another practical issue. Could you really have a wall?
Well,
right?
you know, what a lot of people who've never been on the border don't understand is that Rio Grande River doesn't run in a straight line. It's a snake, you know.
Yeah.
And I mean, you would have to build the wall, practically speaking, probably 2 or 3 miles off the river just because of the topography of that area. And so, you know, you could do that in some high traffic areas. And really, the investment you made in the barrier would probably pay off economically in the long run to Texas, because Ford and I feel every day the cost of what illegal immigration has cost Texas. You know, arguably there are some benefits to people coming across and working, but we do know the cost in terms of education, in terms of health care. It's a very real cost to the state of Texas and the taxpayers. So I think a barrier in certain places could serve a real purpose if it was done properly.
Yeah. Are you pro-wall or anti-wall?
Well, a pro-wall is a piece of the overall solution to the problems that we're facing.
But it's not the only answer.
It's not the only answer.
Right. Chairman Smithee makes an interesting point that's, again, a helpful transition. You know, you've got a bunch of people in the state who are here without documentation, but we educate them and we'll give them health care and, in fact, treat them like our friends and neighbors because they're our friends and neighbors. But it does get to this question of whether the undocumented population is a burden on the state and whether the dollars deployed to serve people, physical and social infrastructure, might be better deployed elsewhere. We are apparently getting ready, according to the Lieutenant Governor, to have a conversation yet again about removing the state law, been in place since 2001, that would provide in-state tuition rates to the children of undocumented persons, I should say. Are you for, that law was passed in 2001. Chairman, you probably voted on that law. Did you vote for it or against it?
Well, I voted for it. You know, there was only one no vote in the House out of all the House members, and frankly, at that time, it wasn't that big a deal. You know, that was before the real influx
Right.
of illegal immigration.
Have things changed to the point where we need to get rid of that law?
I think we should look at changing it and possibly abolishing it. You know, one of the problems that we have is that our universities are so. Most of our universities are very difficult to get into now, much
Right.
more so than they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And so I think there are potentials to maybe, even if you don't abolish the law, to maybe modify the law to provide some educational opportunities under certain conditions. Actually, the law right now is not just a blank check. It has certain requirements in it that people have to meet.
Right.
And so it's possible that you could, but you really should modify that significantly,
Right.
because most of the universities don't have a lot of extra room right now.
Right, of course, I'm not suggesting that the chairman is saying this, but others have occasionally mistaken the concept of admission for tuition. This really isn't about spots, it's so much about what people pay. So what do you think? I mean, people would suggest if we're going to have folks in the state and they're going to remain in this state, it'd be good to give them an education, opportunity to get education, move them into the workforce, make them productive members of our communities. You never voted on the first bill, you were not in the legislature.
I was not there.
So what would you do if the bill came up in the House?
What you just said, those are arguments that make, sense from the standpoint of wanting to create an environment that we are promoting students to become productive members of our society, taxpayers and job holders. But I don't think we need to create bad incentives. So
Do you think this is a magnet for illegal immigration?
I think it can be. And I want to get back to the part where if somebody is in the country illegally, we don't need to create a system where we are benefiting their children by allowing them to pay in-state tuition. That
Right.
doesn't make as much sense to me. So I think that if they were admitted to a university, that university should be able to charge them out-of-state tuition, just like if my child went to, the University of Oklahoma, then I would pay out-of-state tuition. And so, it gets back to where are they legally residing?
Right.
What's the law and what's the incentive? I mean, you can make arguments for and against from a policy standpoint, but at the end of the day, I think we need to incentivize folks abiding by our existing laws.
Well, so since we're talking about higher ed and we're talking about the cost of higher ed, let me ask you about higher ed affordability. This is obviously a conversation that's going to come up in the next session. The presidents and chancellors of the public universities in the state of Texas have asked for a modest increase in tuition rates because they say correctly that the state's contribution to higher ed funding over the last 25 years has been on a downward slope, and yet the state's population is growing. More kids want to go to college. We talk about wanting to get kids into and out of college and into the workforce. On the campaign trail, Chairman Price, there's a conversation around free college. That if you make $125,000 or less in your household, that you might have the opportunity to attend a school like this one at no cost, or a public university at no cost. What do we do about this? Is free college a good idea? And if it's not a good idea, what about the idea of giving schools the opportunity to raise a little bit more money through tuition?
The idea of free college really sounds good till you figure out who's going to pay for it, because somebody is going to pay for it, and that's us, and that's everybody that's paying taxes. And so the idea of free college, I think, is somewhat of a red herring, because I don't think that's practical. I don't think that makes a lot of economic sense. What does make sense is reining in the cost to make it affordable. So, for instance, if you look at not just the cost, but what's driving that cost, in some respects, I think part of that is that we're not really operating in a free market. So the availability and ease of student debt is out there. So if a student wants to obtain a student loan, it is very easy for them to get. So there's no incentive for an institution of higher education to rein in necessarily their tuition if they know it's going to be met and satified, no matter what the cost is.
You think higher ed is charging too much of our families?
No, I think in some cases it's becoming unaffordable. Now, I had a bill last session that Chairman Schwartner in the Senate authored in the Senate and I carried in the House, which would have put restrictions on that, on tuition, and would allowed for increase in fees if students approved, but it was going to tie it to inflation, and that was met with stiff resistance by presidents and chancellors of universities across the state. But families are really struggling with the cost of higher education, and so we need to make sure that what we're doing makes sense and that there's not expenditures and costs at those institutions which are really outside the classroom that are inflating the cost of families. And so I think that's important to focus on that issue.
Chairman Smithee, your colleague from Amarillo, Senator Seliger, as the chair of the Higher Ed Committee, and his colleague, his counterpart in the House, your colleague John Zerwas, chairman of Higher Ed, both think that we should not give universities the license to raise tuition even modestly because they're not satisfied the money being given to public universities is being spent wisely now.
And I think that's I agree. I think that's a good point. Yeah. You look at not only the physical plant of most universities, but also at their payroll, and you see that a very large percent, in fact, a majority of the money is going for something other than instruction, for college instruction. Colleges are doing so many things now. You know, they've become entertainment, the athletic programs, of course, and at some point, I think that we have to have some colleges, and the community colleges have done a very good job in this area because they do provide a very good value in most cases for the students. And I think we need some 4-year programs that are basically cost conscious about dealing, because this is a real problem for there are a lot of our young people that we represent in this area who just a few dollars in tuition and fee costs will make the difference of whether they can go to college or not. And so this is probably one of the critical issues facing Texas over the next 20, 25 years, is finding a way to restructure higher education so it becomes more attainable and more affordable for more students.
As you know, Chairman Smithee, the former chair of the Higher Ed Committee in the House, Dan Branch, no longer in the legislature, was a big advocate for funding higher ed based on outcomes rather than inputs. So, rejigger the formula so that we reward the universities that get kids in and out in a timely fashion. Right now, we run numbers. We have a database on our website of the kids who enter 8th grade in Texas public schools, 300,000 kids or so. We track them all the way through high school, and then we track them 6 years out. And the reality is that the completion rate for Texas kids, public school kids who go to public university, in 6 years is about 1 in 5. We're only graduating about 20% of Texas kids through public universities in 6 years, and that would be 4-year, 2-year, or just some kind of a completion certificate, even a technical school. What are we doing wrong? And why can't we get kids in and out? Well, that would solve some of the debt problems that Chairman Price is talking about. If you're there less time, you incur less debt. But maybe we need to put on to the universities, get these kids through in a more efficient way.
And we can do a much better job of that. You know, one of the problems is kids, young people enroll in college, and you know, they have no idea what they're going to do. And so they go in, they take a year or two, they change their major, and you know, they basically lose hours that they paid for. Well, not only have they paid for them, but we paid for them as well, because the state subsidizes to some extent. So absolutely, I think that that universities can do a better job of putting incentives in place to get these students in and out of there as quickly as possible.
Right, and you know, Chairman Price, the 60 by 30 plan that is now in vogue, this is the plan to move us forward on higher ed, presumes that by 2030, 60% of Texas higher ed enrollees will get out in 6 years. Right now, that rate is 38%. Pretty ambitious to think that we're going to go from 38 to 60 by 2030.
It is, but that's the kind of ambition we need. That's exactly where we should be.
Got to have a goal.
You need that, and you need to be able to measure it. And so the types of issues that you're bringing up here is exactly what has to be addressed. And you know, we're sitting on the campus of a community college, and the fact is, we discussed with presidents this morning from several area community colleges how many students are getting their start on community college campuses. So, you know, when we talk about higher ed, I think it's easy sometimes to just navigate towards the 4-year universities, the cost, and the issues, you know, dealt with at that level. But also the community colleges can't be forgotten in this mix, because so many folks do get their start there, and so many of the jobs that are being filled today and will be needed to be filled in the future, that training and education starts right here.
Starts like this. So we've got about 10 minutes left before we're going to go to questions from the audience, and I've got microphones here. We have microphones in the aisles. I want to encourage you to line up. I thought we would spend the last time on an easy one, since I've made this so hard for you, and that's public school finance. So until recently, education costs, principally public school costs, that was the #1 line item in the state budget forever and ever. And you know that the system is constantly in the courts. It's not equitable, it's not adequate, it's out of compliance with the Constitution. So the last round of this, something like more than 600 of the school districts in the state sued, and a lower court said, yes, the system is unconstitutional, went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court came back a couple of months ago and said that the system of funding public schools is really, really, really bad, just not bad enough, right? They were not going to put the gun to the heads of the legislature.
It was kind of like Director Comey's indictment
Yes.
of Hillary Clinton. You know?
Right.
It's bad, but not bad enough.
I see what you did there. That was actually. May I say, you should be doing Donald Trump's debate prep. That was a very nice pivot. But so the issue is basically they're kicking it back to you and saying you all fix it. We're not going to do it. Chairman Smithee, again, I draw on your many years in this job and your experience. You've seen how many of these situations where it goes into courts, comes back, you all put a Band-Aid on it, the Band-Aid comes off, you go back to court. Can't you just fix it?
Well, you know, I was on a legislative panel a week ago in Dallas, and because I think this kind of explains the situation. Most of the legislators most of the legislators have been there less time than I have, but they had been there a very short time, and they all said, "Oh yeah, we're going to fix it this next session." And then what we all had in common is the way we viewed fixing the system was to give our districts more money. And I look at these guys that are on the panel with me, and they're representing some of the wealthiest school districts in Texas, and they're complaining about not having enough money. And I'm thinking, you're the ones we're going to get our money from, you know, when we go back to meet.
Right.
But they want more money as well. And so what you realize is that whenever you have a bill, the first thing that happens is they do these computer printouts. Every member of the legislature goes and looks at their school district, you know, their school districts. Four and I both represent a number of school districts with wide range of wealth. But we look at our districts and how they come out. Well, if our districts don't come out well, we're not going to vote for it. No legislator is going to vote for any plan that leaves his or her school district worse than it was before. And as a result of that, I'm pretty pessimistic about this. I was kind of hoping the court would do something. But I think that to have any meaningful change, you're going to have to put a lot of new money into the system to put something in there for everybody.
So do it.
Well, that's the question. That's the issue. You know,
couldn't you? You could put the money in.
This is going to be probably one of the tougher sessions to do that.
Right. Price of oil is down about $45. That does not help.
Yeah, we're going to have a fairly flat line budget this time.
Or less money than last time for sure, I would suspect. Yeah.
And so, you know, if you were ever going to do that, it almost has to be done in one of those years where you have a large budget surplus projected coming in. So it's a tough time to do that. So I don't expect anything really this session of any landmark proportion other than maybe just a Band-Aid approach. But we have got some real inequities in the system right now. It's very complex. All the weights that are put on funding have worked unfairly against a number of school districts. For instance, Four and I represent a lot of moderately poor, not almost average, but moderately poor, low-growth districts. Those districts really get hurt in the current formula funding. And so, you know, we would like to change that. But in order to change that, we're going to have to change some other parts of the formula that are going to draw opposition from other
people. Now, the one
people.
thing I'll say that changes that dynamic a little bit, and I don't know if it's enough to swing it, but you know, there were 2 days of hearings recently in the House, joint hearings between the Public Education Committee and the Appropriations Committee, where this was discussed at length. Yeah. I mean, a lot of options floated and a lot of input from people all over the state of Texas. Well, in our neck of the woods, I got to say, you know, our school districts do an incredible job. They do a great job and often with very little resources. And I think that that's not indicative necessarily of certain pockets of the state. Just like any industry, you're going to have some bad actors and you're going to have good ones and all that. But what was interesting to me is that we've been talking about the inequities of the system and how we'd like to change it, you know, and make it better for everybody. But it's hard to do because of the political realities that John talked about. But for the first time in a long time, Houston is now facing recapture, which it has not faced in a long time. So it's going to be paying back over $160 million to the state. And so now you have over 24 House members from in and around Harris County, and you've got several senators. And so the political will to maybe take a look at some of the components of our formula funding will maybe be there when it hasn't been there in the past just because of the numbers involved. And then I think, too, as Chairman Otto said and was really reinforced in this last hearing, the most equitable thing we can do, even if we're going to make some incremental changes, is to increase the basic allotment. That will help everybody.
So I want to ask two things before we go to questions on this. The first, and I no disrespect to the two of you, I know that you're answering honestly, but I don't accept as a taxpayer or as the citizen the idea that this is too hard to fix. Oh well, which has seemed to be the answer from the legislature for as long as I've lived in this. I've lived in Texas 25 years, and I feel like from the very moment I arrived in Texas, I've heard this is too hard for us to fix. We've sent a man to the moon. I can hold my phone up at the Whole Foods to pay for groceries. Those are hard things. We do those, right? Why can't we fix school finance? I just don't understand why this is any harder than anything else, Chairman.
Well, I mean, you have to start with the proposition that no problem is unsolvable politically. You have to view it from the standpoint there's a solution there, we've just got to find it. And so I agree with you. And we've punted this a long way down the road. We had opportunities in the past to actually make some meaningful progress. The legislature as a whole never did it. But we do have a responsibility. You know, it's interesting. One of about the only thing that Four and I have any responsibility for to people outside our district is education, because the Constitution tells us that we have a duty to provide for an efficient system, not just for the children that live in our district, but for all of the state of Texas. So that's an oath we take. So we should take that very seriously. It is not a problem without a solution. The solution will be very politically difficult. It would have helped to have a court to hold a gun at our heads, as painful as that might be, but there will be other incentives as well. And this may not be the session to fix it, but I do think we need to make progress and at least have a target date of not less than 10 years to totally fix the system. It could take a while.
Hey, Chairman Price, I hear you say that we have to increase the basic allotment. You know, there is a big conversation in public ed around whether money is the issue. You know, we have a public education system that does not, in its performance, meet the high aspirations of a state that talks about exceptionalism all the time. We want to be first at everything and best at everything, and our public school system, based on the results that we provide, is kind of middle of the pack compared to other states. We're not really, not to write home about. We want to be better. So if that's the case, the question is money the answer? I hear you say increase the basic allotment, but there are just as many people in the legislature and in your party who will say money is not the issue because there are states that spend more per student and their results are worse than ours.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to tell you that solves all of the problem. I mean, just increasing the basic allotment is not going to definitely fix the problems that face public education.
Right.
I'm saying under our current structure, the current formula, the most equitable thing we can do is to increase the basic allotment. So that's very different than just saying let's put more money into education, because we already spend an enormous amount of money, billions of dollars, on public education. We have over 1,000 public school districts. We have over 5 million public school students. We have something like 80,000 coming into the system, you know, right now. So just by virtue of the growth in our system, we may need to input more money into the basic allotment
to keep up with growth.
So if you're really talking about taking a long-term perspective and improving public education, I think you have to look at the way we structure those payments to the districts, because what is currently in place is now been band-aided several times. There's lots of different weights and measures that go into that is very hard for folks to understand, because no two districts look the same. And so you have all these differing interests trying to fix a problem that looks different to everybody. So we really do have to attack it at a high level, and that's hard to do without sometimes a special session or where that's the only issue, because as you well know, during 140 days with everything else that's going on at the same time, it can make it
plenty of other
challenging.
stuff on the agenda.
But I think it's solvable. I don't want to give you the impression that I think that we give up. I think it's solvable, and it's something we'll focus on and prioritize.
Excellent. All right, so we have microphones. Please don't be shy. Get up, and we'll ask you to ask your question, and we'll start over here with this gentleman. And believe me, if you don't ask questions, I'll ask more. They'd rather you ask questions than me.
You can't be sure I'm a gentleman.
Well, we'll see.
Alan Abraham, Amarillo. Throw into the mix the charter school movement and how that might help public education. It sounds to me like free enterprise solutions,
Right.
which I personally wouldn't trust. But when I was going to school, college, I learned about vouchers. That's long since passed. They have new terms for it, but it's the same system.
Right.
Diverting some public money into the private system
Right.
to tackle it. I'd like to hear some input.
Well,
from
let's
that.
talk about that because, in fact, that will definitely come back around. You know, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, is maybe the school choice advocate more than anybody else in the whole state of Texas. He made this a priority in each of the last 2 sessions. And what happened was a school choice bill, whether it's vouchers, call it whatever you want, passed the Senate and it went to die in the House. The House did not take up that bill in a way that advanced that cause. Where do you both stand on choice all the way up to vouchers, and do you think it's got a chance in the House that's not going to look different from the House last time, Chairman?
Well, I mean, first of all, I've got to, it depends to some extent where you're from. Ford and I both represent districts that are at least partially rural.
Right.
And I have school districts with 15 students and with more land than the city of Houston and 15 students. So as a practical matter, you're not going to have a voucher program in that school district.
Right.
So it's not for everyone. But on the other hand, you know, I think that we shouldn't be afraid to look at anything. We know that our school system is not performing at the level we want it to. It does very well, but it's not performing at the level we would like. And so I'm not afraid to try any new idea. If we do anything, I'd prefer to do it on a demonstration basis, on a temporary demonstration basis, so that we can evaluate what it does, how well it works.
But you'd be open to voting for something that expanded choice in the way that the questioner is asking.
Yeah, if the proper safeguards were put on there.
Right.
I don't want to just write a blank check to somebody to do something, but I do think that we should be open and willing to look at new ideas.
You understand, Chairman, that there's a continuum when we talk about school choice. There's giving kids the option of leaving the school that they're in now and going to another school in their district. That's currently the law, right? You can do that. Then there's the opportunity to have kids go to expanded numbers of charter schools. That's also something that is currently the case, not unlimited. But then we get into the complicated part. If you're going to give a parent a voucher or some kind of a check for an amount toward the amount that the state would be paying,
right,
and say, take it across the street to a parochial school or a private school and go do it. The Lieutenant Governor's pointed out to me when we've had this conversation, he said, I don't know how he knows this. He said, you send your kids to private school, why should you be the only one who is allowed to do that? That's kind of a brushback pitch, I thought, from the Lieutenant Governor. I mean, but he makes a point. Why should people who have the means to do that be the only ones who have that option?
The issue is we've discussed it in theoretical terms for a long time.
Yeah.
So the real problems come up when you look at specific legislation. When you look at the black and white of a
It
proposed
gets down to
bill.
the details.
It does. And so, you know, we've got tremendous school choice here in the Panhandle. So if a student wants to transfer among schools within a district, or even transfer districts, or be homeschooled, or go to a private school, it all exists.
Yeah.
No problem. The hard thing is, and I think that it's never been, at least since I've been in the legislature, adequately defined, is how are you going to, at the same time, take money out of the public education system when the Constitution, Article 7, Section 1, which John referenced, says you have to maintain a free and public school system. You have to support it and maintain it.
Right.
So at a time where we arguably are just barely above the constitutional requirement to fund our public schools, you know, everybody has sympathy for kids that are trapped in a truly failing school. And from what I understand, most of that occurs not in the Panhandle of Texas, so where we live, but
Yep.
it's occurring in high urban areas, maybe in Dallas, maybe in Houston, maybe in San Antonio. And if there's a way that those kids can have options, I think you attack the problem where it exists. But we don't have that problem up here, so we've never, and that hasn't been
Right, but as
defined in a bill.
Chairman Smithee said, you have responsibility for the entire state's
Exactly.
education, not just for your
So
community.
one
you
size
can
fits all is very
acknowledge-
difficult.
You can acknowledge that possibly doing right by the city of Houston would be in your purview.
Not if it hurts the other kids in other areas of the state. So I think you have to balance that.
Quickly, are you sympathetic to the argument that if money leaves the public education system, the problem is that no accountability measures go with those dollars that exist in the public school?
Well, if tax dollars are going out, they actually, well, we have to measure those metrics. We have to know if they're being
But you know,
adequately
that's
spent.
part of the controversy, Chairman Smithee, is that my taxpayer dollars leave the system. Are those public and parochial schools held to the same accountability standards as the public schools?
And then some of those schools say, well, if we have to meet the same accountability standards you do, we can't do our thing.
We don't want it.
And we can't be better than public education. So that's going to be a debate that'll go on forever.
It's a complicated issue, certainly. Sir.
Hello, Alan R-Amarillo, Amarillo, Texas. I have a question for Representative Smithee. It's regarding ethics. You've said in the past that that's one of the priorities that you have is to see ethics reform. So my question is, what do you see as the problem regarding ethics that needs to be fixed, and then how do you propose to fix that? And of course, I'd love to hear what Fort Price has to say as well.
Excellent
Thank
question.
you.
This came up in the last session. It was on the governor's list of items that were in his priorities, and it was the only one of his items that did not actually make.
Yeah, you know, you pass an ethics bill about every 10 or 15 years till people figure out how to get around it, and then you have to pass another one to block those loopholes. Right. And so we've got some areas primarily with reporting and things of that nature. You know, relationships. We've seen some abuses that we can probably deal with statute. What we found out is ethics bills include two provisions. One are those that protect you from us, and those are the ones that protect us from you, that shield us as a legislature. My view of an ethics bill is it ought to protect you from us. I don't like the parts that protect us from them.
Give me an example of something that protects you from us.
Well, for one thing, there was an amendment went on the ethics bill, or a change went on, but when it came to the floor, remember last session they had the people going around the Capitol taping people with a camera.
Correct.
Unknowingly, you know, they were taping people, and so this legislation would have banned that. Well, that you know is I always hate legislation that deals with a particular immediate issue because it tends to make bad public policy in the long run. But the idea that you have to if you're going to operate any kind of camera in the Capitol, you've got to get the permission of the person that you're talking to. That's a little onerous too.
But of course, as you know, what killed the ethics bill, not to get down into weeds here, but I suppose we're in the weeds business, right? What killed the bill last time was an amendment, I believe it was by Senator Huffman of Houston, that created a so-called spousal loophole that said that Mrs. Smithee or Mrs. Price could do whatever business they wanted to do, and that we in the public were not required to know about it, even though what they were doing to make money in your household might run smack perpendicular into the work you were doing on behalf of your constituents. So can you guys just pass an ethics bill that is transparent, that discloses, and lets us know that you're doing the public's business and not your own?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. And I think that we saw evidence of that last session with regard to two things. We saw it with regard to the disclosure of any familial relationship with contracts that the state may be entering into, which did not previously exist, which I think was a real good improvement. And then secondly, with contracting generally, one of the largest areas of state waste, I think, that we've seen in years, we now have ethics provisions built into SB 20, which passed that really enhances the disclosure requirements on what we're spending money on and who's doing business with the state and what that looks like. So it's not only, I think, is you know, specific as an elected office holder and their spouse and what information is publicly available. I think we also need to focus on, and will continue to focus on, where the state is spending money and doing business, because that's where I think in the past we've seen a lot of abuse.
Do we have a right as a state, and do your constituents have a right as the people who vote you into office to know where every dollar funding your political operations comes from?
Yes.
Full and total transparency. So we should disclose so-called dark money that comes in the door through another legal construct but is not obligated to be disclosed? We should disclose everything?
Well, if it goes to a candidate, I think you need to know who it's from. Now, one of the concerns I've got is that most of the so-called dark money is going to challengers who challenge incumbents. Very seldom does somebody not give to an incumbent and not say, this is coming from me. I want you to know I'm giving this. And on the other hand, dark money, what's been called dark money, tends to go to challengers. And to some extent, I think that a ban on that is intended to stop challengers from challenging. Dark money is where people give to an organization and then in turn gives to a candidate. Yeah.
But of course, what's good for the incumbent is good for the challenger, is good for the state. I mean, one would think. You can't just say, only if you're a challenger do you have to disclose the source of your contributions.
No. I think that if a political action committee receives donations and then it decides, I think there's a distinction that needs to be made. One is on issues advocacy. And we saw that during the civil rights movement. And so if you're going to advocate on an issue and you're going to educate the public, that's a very different scenario than if you are going to run ads for or against a candidate who's running in a race.
In the latter case, you
And
think
so
there should be
I think
more
there should be disclosure, because if a political action committee receives contributions and then funds a candidate, I think the public needs to understand where that money's originating from and where it comes from.
Sir.
Good afternoon, Jim Louder, Amarillo. Appreciate the really intelligent questions and the thoughtful answers. Little bit dismayed by the talk about more taxes, more money. Back to education, as a substitute teacher and a coach and a taxpayer and a referee, I see a lot of differences in schools from when I was a kid. I'd like to know, I see more constraints, I see a lot more bureaucracy, I see, and I don't buy into the proposition that more money equals better performance. I think that's measurable in a lot of different ways. How can we hold parents more accountable, which I see as a fundamental problem, and stop blaming taxpayers who are already overburdened for not giving enough, and stop blaming teachers for problems that they did not create and they cannot solve in the classroom?
I think we would acknowledge, Chairman Smithee, that it is different today and that schools often have to play the role of surrogate parents, right? There's the social and emotional learning piece is a huge conversation within public education around the state. Can you do anything to make parents own their piece of this at the legislature?
I'm not sure the government can tell parents how to be parents. It's a sociological issue that I think probably is outside of our realm, in government. Because
Well, fair enough, but the consequence of not doing anything is that we burden taxpayers more and give teachers problems that are insoluble. So
Let me jump in there
please.
real quick, because Jim, I hope that you didn't walk away or have the impression that we're advocating higher taxes just to throw money at a problem, because that's
No,
that's not
I appreciate the nuanced and thoughtful answers.
Yeah, that's not what I'm advocating. I don't think that's what John is advocating either. But I do think that given the world we live in, with a state as diverse and as geographically, large as Texas, with 27 million people growing, 5 million public school students, et cetera, it's hard to legislate morality and good parenting. And in fact, it's impossible. But what we can do is, I think we need to value our educators more. We need to do what we can to provide better value to our teachers, because really, when our students are in their classroom, they are a tremendous influence to those kids. And they're not substitute parents, but in many cases they have to parent some of these students. So we need to do what we can there. I think that's important. I think the way we fund our educational system right now is not great. I think we're spending billions of dollars, which may be adequate. The Supreme Court said it's constitutional, but the way it's distributed among the districts could be improved, and that would help resources, because they're all the kids in different districts are required to achieve the same standards. So whether you live in the Highland Park District in Amarillo or the River Road District in Amarillo, your resources may be very different, but your standards are the same. So we need to make sure that our students have the same opportunity across the board. And so I think that the way we treat and value our educators, the way we fund our system ultimately, regardless of the amount, the actual number, because I think that there's inefficiencies and equities that exist out there, but we need to address those. And a lot of this comes down to local control. We elect local school boards to do a lot of the jobs that face the problems that we're facing in many cases. A lot of this, that we're discussing is really about how they manage their districts, and many of them do a fantastic job, and there are some that don't do a fantastic job. And so, I think that we elect them locally for a good reason, to manage some of these issues locally. And, I think our issues up here are very different than what might exist in the Metroplex or in Harris County or in South Texas, for instance. Very different.
And not only are we can't vote for a tax bill this session. Not only would we get beat for re-election, we'd have to leave town if we did. So we're not passing any raising any taxes this time.
Agnes, you're telling me I can take one more? Okay, very well. Is this you, sir? Yes.
Bill Wright from Amarillo, Texas. I'm representing Texas Medical Marijuana. I know a lot of people don't think this issue has anything to do with today's, but I just wanted to inform you that states that have legal cannabis, medical cannabis, it is shown that drug cartels profits have gone way down. Another thing is you talk about school and student loans. If you are arrested for less than an ounce of marijuana, you get a Class 3 felony, misdemeanor. A Class 3 misdemeanor disqualifies you for any student loans
Okay,
or
so
any federal.
let me ask what your question is.
My question is, are we going to get any movement this session on?
This is actually an issue that is a national issue, and it's an issue at the state legislature. It really falls under the heading of criminal justice reform, sentencing reform. Let me ask either of you, I mean, you're the chair of the Judiciary and Civil Jurisprudence Committee. What do we need to do on this, what is really a very big issue in the state of Texas?
Well, you know, Texas has, like all other jurisdictions, the drug crimes, the marijuana crimes, I should say, are not the use crimes, not the sale, but the use crimes are not prosecuted, the punishment is less than what it used to be.
But there's a classification issue, is there not, Chairman Smithee?
There is, yeah.
Right.
And you know, and so I'm not to the point where I want to undo any of the drug laws. I still want to keep the drug laws in place. The medical marijuana issue is one that I think all of us are learning about. I'm not there yet. I wouldn't support it, but anytime you want to talk about it or any input, I'll sure be glad to listen.
Did you support Representative Stephanie Click's, I guess it was cannabis oil bill? Yeah. That passed last session that was it was the nose under the tent of this conversation about medical marijuana. You all, in fact, did move slowly, but you did move in the direction of this issue in the last session.
I voted no on that, but I also I saw the argument, and she made a very persuasive argument.
Specifically, I believe, as a treatment for epilepsy, was it not?
Yeah,
right.
And it was just the cannabis oil.
Just the oil.
Yeah.
Right. Chairman Price, did you support that bill?
No, I voted no as well. The reason I voted no was on that bill, there was specific concern articulated by our prosecutors across the state with respect to the marijuana plants being grown locally and being able to, you know, prosecute somebody for growing it for medical reasons and making that distinction versus, you know, maybe a recreational use or sale reason. And so it wasn't necessarily with regard to the treatment. I think that, you know, science has established there's been some efficacy with regard to the use of medical cannabis oil in highly regulated quantities and the way that's done, especially for the treatment of epilepsy. So it really had nothing to do with the medical use and treatment. It had more to do with the enforcement and the law enforcement concerns with regard to the growing of the plants themselves.
If you had told me when I woke up this morning to come to Amarillo that the last word in this conversation would be about pot, I would have been surprised. but one of the many things that surprised me in the work I get to do. Wonderful to have an opportunity to be with Representative for Price, Representative John Smithee. Please give them a big hand. Thank you, Dr. Hart. Appreciate it. We will come back to Amarillo again soon, I promise you. Thank you very much for coming today. Good. Really enjoyed it.